She had $11 to her name, a dog with one torn ear, and a town full of people waiting to watch her fail one more time. When the auctioneer called out the abandoned Hargrove cabin, condemned, half collapsed, sitting on land nobody wanted, she raised her hand before she'd even finished thinking it through. The room laughed. Someone in the back muttered that she'd lost her sense along with her father's forge, but the moment the gavel came down, and the cabin became hers for $4.60, her dog Scout went rigid at her side, ears pinned forward, a low sound rising in his throat that she had never once heard him make. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her, toward the north wall of a building that hadn't been touched in 11 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calloway and her faithful dog Scout. If you have ever stood in a room while people laughed at the very thing that would save you, tell us in the comments below. We read every one. And if you've ever found more worth in something overlooked than in something shined and polished for show, you already understand the kind of woman this story is about. Grayling Hollow, Montana Territory, in the spring of 1887, was not a large town, but it was proud of the little it had. 2 churches, a mercantile with a real glass window, and a blacksmith shop that had, for 19 years, belonged to a man named Thomas Calloway. Thomas was the kind of man whose hands were always black with soot, and always gentle anyway. He had built that shop plank by plank with his own back, and when his wife died bringing their daughter Josephine into the world, he had raised the girl in the shadow of the forge, teaching her to read the weight of iron before she ever learned her letters properly. She grew up with the smell of coal smoke in her hair, and the ring of hammer on anvil, as steady in her ears as a heartbeat. Josephine was 17 when her father's cough began, and 20 when it finally took him. In the years between, she had learned to run the forge herself. Not glamorous work for a woman in those days, and she heard about it plenty, from church pews and porch steps alike. But Thomas had never once suggested she couldn't. He'd only shown her how to angle a horseshoe, how to read a crack in metal before it split, how to keep a fire honest. She remembered the particular smell of those lessons best of all: hot iron and coal smoke, the sharp tang of the quench water, the way the whole shop seemed to breathe when the bellows worked. When he died, she kept the shop running with a determination that surprised everyone except the man who'd taught her. She remembered, too, the small rituals that had made the forge feel like more than a business. Every evening, after the fire banked low, and the last customer's horse clopped away down Main Street, Thomas would sit on the porch step with a tin cup of coffee gone cold, and let Scout rest his head across his boots, scratching the dog's torn ear absently, while he talked about nothing in particular: the weather, the price of iron, an old story about his own father's forge back east. Josephine had thought, in those evenings, that nothing could ever take that feeling away from her. She had been wrong, but she did not know it yet. What she did not know, in those years of grief and work-worn hands, was that the bank holding her father's modest loan was not run by a patient man. Silas Vance had come to Grayling Hollow 8 years earlier, with a tailored coat and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he had built his fortune the way some men build a fence, plank by plank, around anything he wanted to keep others out of. He remembered, though few others did, that Thomas Calloway had once refused to sell him the strip of land behind the forge, land Vance wanted for a freight depot. Thomas had turned him down kindly but firmly, saying a man ought to keep what his family built. Vance had smiled that day too. He was good at smiling on the days that mattered least. He had not forgotten the refusal, and men like Silas Vance rarely did. He kept a private ledger of slights the way other men kept accounts of debts owed, and Thomas Calloway's name had sat in that ledger for the better part of a decade, waiting patiently for an opportunity Vance had never doubted would eventually come. When it did come, in the form of a grieving daughter, running a forge alone, he did not think of it as cruelty. He thought of it, as he thought of most things, as simply collecting what he was owed. For years, the loan on the forge sat quiet, an old arrangement, from when Thomas first built the place, paid down slow and steady, penny by penny, the way most frontier debts were paid. Josephine kept up every payment her father had promised, sometimes trading labor when coin ran short, and the bank's ledger clerk, a soft-spoken man named Elias Pruitt, had always taken it kindly, marking the books square. But 2 winters after Thomas passed, Vance took a personal interest in reviewing outstanding accounts, and Josephine's modest, honorably paid loan was suddenly recorded as being in arrears, its terms rewritten on paper she had never signed, its due date moved up by a full year. When she brought her own records to prove otherwise, Vance told her, with the same smile he'd worn outside her father's shop years before, that paperwork could be lost, and that a woman running a smithy alone was, in his words, an arrangement the bank could no longer in good conscience carry. The town watched it happen the way towns often do, murmuring sympathy from a safe distance. A few good people, like the widow Ferris who ran the boarding house, tried to speak up for her at the bank, but Vance owned enough of Grayling Hollow's paper that few dared cross him outright. On a gray Tuesday in March, the forge, the tools, even her father's old leather apron, were sold at auction to cover a debt that had been invented on a ledger page. Josephine stood at the back of the crowd that day, and watched strangers carry away the anvil her father had hauled in on a mule cart the year she was born. She did not cry where anyone could see her. She had Scout's rough head under her hand, and she had decided, somewhere in that long silent walk home, that she would not let Grayling Hollow watch her break. Scout had come to her 3 years before, a half-grown cattle dog with a torn ear and a stubborn refusal to be given away, found starving near the old mill road. Thomas had let her keep him over her own doubts about another mouth to feed, saying, "A dog that survives that kind of trouble usually turns out worth the trouble himself." He had been right. Scout was not a large dog, nor a particularly obedient one by other people's standards, but he had an uncanny stillness that came over him whenever something mattered, a stillness Josephine had learned, over the years, never to ignore. On the day of the forge auction itself, Scout had done something she never spoke of to anyone in town, because she wasn't sure they'd believe her, and because it felt, somehow, too private to share. As the last of her father's tools were carried off the property, Scout had walked the perimeter of the yard 3 times, nose low, tail down, before finally sitting at the exact spot where Thomas used to bank the forge fire each night, and letting out one long mournful sound that Josephine had never heard from him before or since. She had thought, at the time, that he was only grieving alongside her. She would come to wonder later whether he had been saying goodbye to something else entirely, some sense, some knowing, that the wrong done to them that day was not the last chapter of the story, only a difficult one in the middle of it. We'll tell you now that this would not be the last time Scout's strange stillness meant far more than anyone around him understood, but for 2 long years afterward, there was little for even the most perceptive dog to notice. Only work, and worry, and a tin of saved coins that grew slower than Josephine liked to admit. After the auction, Josephine took in mending and laundry to survive, work she'd never imagined doing, work that ruined the calluses her father had been so proud of, and replaced them with different ones. She lived in 2 rented rooms above the mercantile, cooked over a small stove, and put away every spare coin in an old tin that had once held her father's pipe tobacco. People in town began to speak of her the way people speak of someone they've decided to feel sorry for and nothing more. Poor Josephine Calloway, who lost the forge, who talks to her dog more than she talks to anyone else, who still walks past the old shop like she expects to find it standing. She did expect it, in a way, not the shop itself, but something like it, some proof that hard work and honest hands still counted for something in a place that had decided otherwise. She did not know yet that proof was already waiting for her, sealed up behind rotted boards in a cabin nobody else wanted, a mile past the edge of town, where an old prospector named Ezra Hargrove had lived alone for 30 years before he vanished without explanation, and left his land to gather dust and rumor. The county had been trying to unload the Hargrove property for 2 years, by the time the spring auction rolled around. It sat on a scrubby rise past the treeline, roof half caved from a bad winter, windows boarded, chimney leaning at an angle that made children dare each other to knock on the door. Nobody in Grayling Hollow wanted it. The land wasn't good for grazing, the well was said to be dry, and old Hargrove himself had been the sort of man people told stories about after dark, a hermit, some said touched in the head, who'd come west chasing gold, and never found enough of it to matter, or so everyone assumed. When the county auctioneer, a cheerful man named Otis Reyes, put the cabin up as the last lot of the day, almost as an afterthought, Josephine had already spent the morning bidding, unsuccessfully, on a small parcel of farmland she'd hoped might let her grow enough to get by without laundering other people's linens for the rest of her life. She had $11 total to her name that day, most of it saved a nickel at a time over 18 months, folded carefully into a handkerchief she kept pinned inside her coat. The morning had been long and hot, the auction ground trampled to dust by boots and wagon wheels, and she had already swallowed 2 disappointments before noon. First the farmland lot going to a rancher with deeper pockets, then a small parcel near the river snapped up before she could even raise her hand. She had not planned to bid on the cabin. She barely looked up when Otis called the lot. It was Scout who reacted first. He had been lying quietly at her feet through the whole auction, patient as always, but the instant Otis said the words, "The old Hargrove place," Scout's head came up sharply, his whole body angled toward the auction block like a compass needle finding north. Josephine felt it more than saw it, a change in the air around her dog, an alertness that had nothing to do with the horseflies or the noise of the crowd. She had learned, over 3 years, that when Scout went still like that, something was true even before she understood what. She raised her hand and bid $4. The laughter started almost immediately, a ripple of it through the crowd, someone saying loud enough for her to hear that the fool girl had lost her shop and was fixing to lose the rest of her savings on a shack that would fall down around her the first hard rain. Otis, embarrassed for her, gave the crowd a chance to bid her up or over, but nobody wanted the Hargrove place badly enough to spend a dime on it, laughing or not. The gavel came down at $4.60, and Josephine Calloway became, to the amusement of half the town, the proud owner of a condemned cabin and 40 acres of scrub nobody else would take for free. She might have laughed along with them, another day. Instead she looked down at Scout, who was already straining gently at the length of rope she used for a leash, pulling toward the road that led to the property, as though the sale had happened 3 weeks too slow for his liking. She walked out to the cabin the next morning before sunrise, telling herself it was only sensible to see what she'd bought, though some quieter part of her admitted she hadn't slept for wondering about it. The mile-long road was still cool with dew, the sagebrush silver in the early light, and Scout trotted ahead of her the whole way, with an eagerness she found almost unsettling in a dog usually content to walk at her heel. The cabin itself was worse up close than it had looked from the road, a sagging porch soft underfoot, a door that hung crooked on one hinge and shrieked when she pushed it open, the whole structure smelling of old pine gone soft with rot, and the mineral dust of 30 untouched years, underlaid with something fainter and sweeter, like the ghost of tobacco smoke long since gone cold. Scout did not hesitate at the threshold the way she did. He went in ahead of her, nose low, moving with a purpose that made the hair rise on her arms, and crossed straight to the north wall of the single room, where he sat down hard, and would not move. She had seen him point at rabbit holes, and rattlesnakes, and, once memorably, at a rock slide before it happened. She had never seen him simply sit, and stare at a wall like it owed him something. She ran her hand along the boards where he stared, feeling for anything unusual, and found only old wood, gray and split with age, until her fingers caught a seam that didn't match the grain around it, a place where 4 boards had been cut and refitted, so carefully done that only a hand looking for it would ever notice, and only a dog whose whole life had been built on noticing things humans missed would ever sit before it and whine. That whine unsettled her more than anything else that morning. It was not Scout's warning growl, nor his happy bark at supper time. It was something lower and stranger, almost mournful, the sound of an animal recognizing something old and important and slightly sad, all at once. She would come to understand, in the weeks ahead, that Scout's reactions were never simple curiosity. He grieved for things, guarded things, celebrated things, as surely as any person might, and on that first morning, sitting before Ezra Hargrove's false wall, he was doing all 3 at once. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a borrowed pry bar, to loosen the boards enough to see what lay behind them, the old nails shrieking free one by one, releasing a puff of dust and cold dry air that smelled faintly of rusted iron and cedar shavings. What she found first was a shallow compartment, no deeper than a flour barrel, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, a metal strongbox, no bigger than a bread loaf, its hinges furred with rust, and beside it, a leather satchel holding papers so carefully preserved that the ink had barely faded. Scout would not let her open either one without pressing his shoulder against her leg, as though standing guard over the moment itself, his breathing quick and shallow with an excitement that felt, to Josephine, almost like joy. She sat back on her heels a long moment before touching either one, struck by the strange gravity of the space, the weight of 30 years of a stranger's careful secrecy pressing into that small dark hollow in the wall. Whoever Ezra Hargrove had been, he had built this hiding place with the patience of a man who trusted no one, and had trusted it to hold until someone worth trusting finally came looking. The strongbox held gold, not a fortune by Eastern standards, but more raw gold dust and small nuggets than Josephine had ever seen outside a store window, enough that her hands shook lifting the little burlap pouches free. But it was the satchel that made her sit back on the cabin floor and forget, for a long moment, to breathe at all. Inside were deeds. Original land deeds, dated a full decade before the town's current records, along with a handwritten journal, in a careful, patient script, and letters addressed to a name she recognized with a jolt, Vance. We won't tell you yet exactly what those papers proved. But we'll say this much. By the time Josephine finished reading through them by lantern light that night, Scout curled protectively against her side, she understood that the treasure in that strongbox was worth far less than the truth in that satchel, and that the truth was about to make her the most dangerous woman in Grayling Hollow. Ezra Hargrove's journal told a story the town had never heard. 32 years earlier, before Grayling Hollow was even a proper town, Hargrove had staked and legally registered claims to nearly the entire valley floor. Land that included, as it happened, the very lots where the bank, the mercantile, and half of Main Street now stood. He had been a quiet, careful man, more interested in prospecting the hills than building an empire, arriving in the territory with little more than a mule, a pan, and a stubborn hope that the valley's quartz veins held more promise than the played-out creeks further west. His early entries were almost cheerful, full of small observations about weather and wildlife, the discovery of a good spring, the pleasure of a valley that seemed to belong, for a while, entirely to him. That cheerfulness curdled slowly across the journal's later pages. When a smooth-talking young land agent named Josiah Vance, Silas Vance's own father, rode into the valley offering to manage Hargrove's claims and handle the paperwork of formal registration with the territorial office, Hargrove, trusting and unfamiliar with legal matters, had agreed gladly, grateful for help with the kind of bureaucratic tangle he had no patience for himself. He wrote, in an entry dated that same week, that he considered himself fortunate to have found an honest young man willing to do an old prospector's paperwork for him. Josephine had read that line twice, feeling something cold settle behind her ribs at the word honest. Josiah Vance had never filed the papers as promised. Instead, over the following 2 years, he quietly resold portions of Hargrove's land to settlers arriving to found the town, pocketing the proceeds, and forging fresh paperwork that listed himself, and later his son, as the rightful original claimants. Hargrove's later journal entries traced his slow, disbelieving discovery of the theft. A chance remark from a settler about Mr. Vance's generous terms, a surveyor's map that no longer matched his memory of his own staked boundaries, a visit to the land office, where a clerk, uneasy and unwilling to meet his eyes, told him the original claim papers appeared to have been lost in a fire that Hargrove was fairly certain had never occurred. By the time Hargrove pieced together the full shape of what had happened, Josiah Vance had died, taking the fraud's clean paper trail with him, and leaving his son Silas to inherit a fortune built on a lie he may not have even fully understood himself at first. Hargrove, old and without the money or standing to fight a bank in territorial court, had simply withdrawn from the town he'd unknowingly built, retreating to this last unclaimed corner of his own valley to live out his years in bitter, quiet solitude. His final journal entries grew sparse and weary, filled less with anger than with a kind of resigned sorrow. He wrote of watching the town grow prosperous on his stolen ground from a distance, of deciding the truth was worth more sealed away safely than spoken aloud to people who would never believe an old hermit over a respectable banker. He kept the truth hidden behind a false wall, rather than risk the ledger, the deeds, and himself vanishing at the hands of a man who had already proven what he was willing to do to keep his fortune clean. Josephine sat with that knowledge, long into the night, Scout's steady breathing the only sound beside the wind working at the loose shingles overhead. She thought of her father's forge, seized on paper that had likely been altered the same careless, confident way. She thought of every family in Grayling Hollow paying rent or mortgage on land that by rights recorded in her lap, might never have been Vance's to sell at all, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her shaking hands, that she was no longer simply a woman who had lost everything. She was, quite possibly, the only person alive who could prove that Silas Vance had built his entire life on a stolen valley. Word travels fast in a small town, even word that's meant to be quiet. Within 4 days, someone at the county recorder's office, paid, Josephine would later learn, in Vance's own coin, mentioned that the widow's daughter had been asking odd questions about old land claims, and had brought in papers bearing the Hargrove name. By the end of the week, Silas Vance himself rode out to the cabin, dressed as though for church, his smile firmly in place, offering to buy the property back from her at triple what she'd paid, out of Christian charity for a young woman who'd clearly overreached herself. Scout did not growl at many people. He growled at Silas Vance from the moment the man's horse crested the rise, a low continuous warning that made Vance's own mount shy sideways twice before he'd even dismounted. Josephine stood on the sagging porch with the smell of fresh-cut lumber around her. She had already begun small repairs, and watched Vance's tailored coat gather dust from the ride, watched his easy smile falter just slightly at the sound coming from low in Scout's throat. She kept one hand resting on the dog's shoulder the whole conversation, grateful for the solid warmth of him, and told Vance, politely, that the cabin wasn't for sale. He left that day, the way he always left uncomfortable conversations, smiling as though he'd won something, but Josephine noticed his eyes had gone twice to the patched section of the north wall before he rode off, and she understood, with a cold settling in her stomach, that he suspected more than he was saying. He returned 2 days later with the county sheriff, and a claim that the Hargrove land had never been legally transferred to the county in the first place, that the auction itself had therefore been invalid, and that as the party who had originally, he said it without blinking, assisted the Hargrove family with their affairs, he retained rightful interest in the property. Sheriff Dunmore, a tired, fair-minded man who had held the post for a decade and grown weary of Vance's habit of appearing at his office with paperwork instead of proof, listened to the claim with visible skepticism, asking twice for documentation Vance seemed unable to produce on the spot. It was a bold lie, built the same way his father had built his fortune, on the assumption that no one poor enough to matter would ever be able to prove otherwise. Josephine, standing on her own porch, with Scout pressed close against her skirts, said only that she would be glad to bring proof of her own to whatever hearing the sheriff cared to arrange. Something in the quiet certainty of her voice, and perhaps something in the way her dog would not stop watching Vance with that low steady growl, made Sheriff Dunmore look at her a moment longer than politeness required, before he agreed to call a proper meeting rather than settle the matter on her porch step. He had not counted on the satchel. He had not counted either on Elias Pruitt, the soft-spoken bank clerk who had quietly kept his own private ledger of irregularities for years, too afraid of losing his position to speak up, but not so afraid that he'd thrown the evidence away. When Josephine came to him, gold dust in a jar and Hargrove's journal in her bag, Pruitt sat very still for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that shook only slightly, that he'd been waiting 11 years for someone brave enough to need what he'd been keeping. The town meeting was called for the following Saturday, ostensibly to settle a property dispute, though by the time the schoolhouse filled past its benches, everyone in Grayling Hollow understood it was about far more than one cabin. Word had spread all week, in hushed voices at the mercantile counter, over back fences, in the pews of both churches, that the widow's daughter had found something out at the old Hargrove place, something that had put fear behind Silas Vance's smile for the first time anyone could remember. By Saturday evening, the schoolhouse windows stood open to let in the cooling air, lantern lights spilling out across the yard where latecomers stood 3 deep, straining to hear. Vance arrived confident, flanked by 2 men from his bank, his coat freshly brushed, ready to present the sheriff with his claim. He had not expected Josephine to arrive with Ezra Hargrove's journal, the original deeds, Josiah Vance's own forged paperwork, bearing his unmistakable handwriting, and Elias Pruitt, standing quietly at her side, ready at last to testify to what he'd watched happen to her father's forge, and to a dozen other families over the years. Scout walked in beside her, calm and steady, and settled at her feet beneath the table exactly the way he had settled beside her father's boots on countless quiet evenings years before, as though some part of him understood this too, was a kind of homecoming. He certainly had not expected Scout. The dog had never once, in 3 years, shown aggression toward a person in town, not toward drunk cowhands, not toward the butcher's temperamental mule, not even toward children who pulled his ears without asking. But when Vance, red-faced and cornered by his own father's handwriting laid bare on the schoolhouse table, lunged forward to snatch the journal from Josephine's hands, and burn the last of his lie in the potbelly stove crackling in the corner, Scout moved faster than anyone in that crowded room, placing his whole solid body between Vance and the table, teeth bared, a sound coming out of him that silenced every whisper in the schoolhouse at once. Vance froze mid-reach, the lantern light throwing his shadow long and trembling against the chalkboard behind him, and did not move again until Sheriff Dunmore himself stepped forward and took him firmly by the arm. It was, several townsfolk would say afterward, the moment they stopped seeing Josephine Calloway as a fool who'd lost her father's shop, and started seeing her as a woman whose dog had simply always known she was worth protecting. The widow Ferris, seated near the front, would later swear she'd never in her life heard a schoolhouse go so silent so fast, nor seen a grown banker look so much like a boy caught stealing from the collection plate. The proof was, in the end, undeniable. A clerk from the Territorial Land Office rode out within the week to examine the documents himself, comparing Hargrove's original claim markers against Josiah Vance's forged registration papers under a magnifying glass borrowed from the mercantile, and pronounced the handwriting discrepancy plain enough for any court in the territory to see. Territorial land records, cross-checked against Hargrove's original claims, and the forged paperwork bearing Josiah Vance's own hand, confirmed everything the journal alleged. Silas Vance's bank was seized within the month pending investigation, his personal assets frozen, and though the wheels of frontier justice turned slowly, they turned decisively enough that by summer's end, Vance had left Grayling Hollow entirely on a stagecoach nobody came to see off, his name synonymous with the very fraud his family had spent 30 years dressing up as respectability. Elias Pruitt's private ledger, it turned out, held enough additional detail about altered accounts and quietly foreclosed loans to open investigations into 3 more of Vance's dealings across the county, and more than one family, besides Josephine's, found old debts forgiven and old land quietly restored in the months that followed. Grayling Hollow, which had spent years assuming Silas Vance's respectability was simply the natural order of things, learned instead just how much had been resting on paper that was never honest to begin with. Josephine did not seek to become wealthy from what she'd found, though the gold alone would have let her live comfortably for years. Instead, working with the Territorial Land Office and a lawyer from the county seat, she helped establish rightful claims for the families whose homes and businesses sat on land Hargrove had never truly lost, her father's forge among them, restored to her not as charity, but as long overdue justice. She used a portion of the gold to rebuild the forge properly, ordering fresh iron and a new bellows from the county seat, and on the morning the first fire was lit in the rebuilt hearth, half the town came to watch, as though the ringing of hammer on anvil again was proof of something they'd all needed to see. She hired Elias Pruitt away from banking entirely, to help her manage its books, a decision he accepted with visible relief, and set aside enough to dig Grayling Hollow its first real town well, on a plot of land that, fittingly, had once belonged to Ezra Hargrove himself. The widow Ferris, who had spoken up for Josephine when few others dared, was among the first to draw water from that well, and she liked to say afterward that it tasted faintly of iron and second chances, though most people assumed she was only being sentimental. Perhaps she was. Grayling Hollow, in the years that followed, became a town that told this story often, at church socials and around winter fires, not as a tale of a fool who got lucky, but as a reminder of what patience, honest work, and a good dog's instincts could uncover, given enough time. The old cabin, the one everyone had laughed at her for buying, she left standing. She had the false wall repaired properly, and where the compartment had been, she placed a small brass plaque bearing Ezra Hargrove's name and the words, "He kept the truth safe until someone came looking for it." Scout visited that spot every single time they walked the property afterward, always sitting a moment before the wall, tail moving slow and easy now, instead of that low mournful whine, as if some old patient grief in the place had finally been allowed to rest. There is a kind of value the world often overlooks, in old cabins, in forgotten journals, in women the town has already decided to stop believing in. Josephine Calloway's story reminds us that the things worth the most rarely announce themselves at auction. Sometimes they wait behind a false wall for 30 years, patient as an old prospector's grief, until the right person, and the right dog, come looking. If you found a hidden piece of history like that, tucked away and waiting, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or would you share it with the people who needed it most? Tell us below. Until next time, stay close.